Welcome to the 10th episode of Travis, Can I Have This? You know, uh, when I started this podcast and I had to label the episodes, for whatever reason, I picked three digits. So instead of just saying episode 1, I did episode 001, which would imply that I'm going to have at least 100 episodes. And who knows if we'll make it that far. But it's pretty crazy we made it to two digits, Maybe we'll make it to three, but hey, at least we made it to two digits. I'm taking that as a win. Today, we are talking about something that I think I might regret talking about. At the time I'm recording this, it is 5 years since COVID rocked our world, especially in the world of dentistry and medicine. And it's been on my mind. And there's part of me that feels like maybe it's too soon to talk about this. Like, do we even really want to talk about this? But I don't know why it's just stuck on my mind right now. And maybe it's just therapy for me to talk about 5 years. And I want to share 5 stories from COVID and in honor of the 5 years and kind of lessons learned and just kind of appreciate where we are today. So just to set the stage a little bit, just to remind us of some trauma, it was March 11th, 2020, when there was that infamous Oval Office message. And a couple days later, March 13th, which was a Friday, there was a national emergency from the White House declared. And the next Monday, which was March 16th, the American Dental Association came out with an announcement to all dentists across the country, the United States of America, and asked them to shut their doors so that they could slow the spread of coronavirus. And it was something like just no one's ever lived through this at like this at any level. And the American Dental Association was not requiring dentists to close their doors, but most did. And it set the stage of some craziness and some anxiety. And if you're asked to close the doors of your business by the government or somebody's asking you to close your doors and you close your doors, who's the first person you call? What are you going to do? I discovered a lot of people call their accountant at that time. And our phones were off the hook. And it was nuts. And just looking back and thinking through that, again, so appreciative that we are where we are today, but also thinking about some of those experiences and some of the craziness that was going on. So I'm going to share 5 stories and get into it today, reliving 5 years since coronavirus rocked the world of dentistry. Story number 1. Okay, I had a meeting with a client in January of 2020. And I don't know why I remember this meeting in so much detail, but I was meeting with a client. I was doing a cash projection with my client, which I do for all of our clients. We do a 6-month cash projection. Cash was looking good. The practice was looking good. And it was a newer client. And so it was kind of I think it was one of our first kind of cash projection meetings. And we were talking about things. And he brought up in the meeting, hey, have you heard about that sickness going around in Asia? Like, should I get some extra working capital? And I remember my answer was like, no, like, why would you need working capital? Like, what do you think is going to happen because of something that's happening in a different continent? Even if it came to America, what's going to happen to your practice? Like, you'll be fine was my thought, right? Like, I just remember being kind of like a little bit dismissive, like, you should have a line of credit anyways. But it was like, the question was, should I get extra money? Should I take out a loan? And I just remember thinking how dismissive I was of that. And looking back on that, like, obviously my client was more in tune with things than I was and, making myself seem like a knucklehead. But I think it just highlights that the world is very unpredictable. And Fortunately, this client did fine. Like he was in a good cash position to begin with. He had a good practice. Obviously, there were some bumps, but he was prepared. And being prepared is better than being predictive. And that's what really where you'll find peace. And you can't, you don't know what everything will be, but there's some general rules of what you can do to be prepared for most things. And if you followed those rules before COVID, you were prepared. But just kind of an interesting, I remember that conversation, and it's always stuck with me on just how you really never know what's going to happen in the future. Even if you kind of might see it coming, you just really don't know. Second story I want to share was there was a new practice owner, and she was supposed to close on her practice sometime in February. It's actually supposed to close like in December of 2019, I think, and it kept getting pushed back for different reasons. And finally, the deal closes and she takes over the practice. The deal closes on Friday, March 13th. So coming into the office on March 16th is her first day as a practice owner. And for anyone who's bought a practice, dental practice, you know that that whole experience of buying a practice is you usually only do it one time, maybe a couple times if you move around a little bit, but really only one time. And it's a very anxious process just because you don't know what to expect and what it's going to go like. Imagine going into your first day as a practice owner and then hearing that all the dental practices in the country are closing their doors. What do I do with my staff? What do I do with this big practice loan that I have? Like, how long is it going to be closed for? What do I do? Like, I just remember talking to her. She was obviously one of the first calls we got, and just trying to figure out cash flow. And the only thing that you could do in her situation is take it day by day. And it ended up being fine. And like one of the big things, like when PPP loans came about, that was such a big thing in those first few months because the dental practices were closed. Their people needed money. Like that was probably the single biggest anxiety thing besides the dentist providing for themselves is if you own a dental practice, you're providing for 7 families or 10 families or however many staff you have. Like you're at times the primary breadwinner is working at your practice and you're feeding families through your practice and not being able to pay them, or some did pay them. It was just a lot of anxiousness. And so these PPP loans came about, which were a great thing, but the PPP loans initially did not have a lot of clarity on people who started a business or bought a practice in March, right? Like right in the heat of COVID. And that was a tough thing to navigate. But we worked hard to find her the right bank to get her that PPP loan. And that made a big difference. And it ended up being fine for her. And she still owns a practice and is doing great. But it was interesting. Like in that moment, I don't think you could paint a worse case scenario for somebody. And the only thing you could do is take it day by day and also, lean on a good team to help support you and navigate the situation as best as possible. But what a crazy situation for someone to buy a practice on the exact day that you're ordered to close. Third story, which is not a specific client story, is about PPP loans. And when COVID started and we started getting wind of all these new bills and legislation, it was a lot of new stuff. And there were a lot of old accountants who didn't have the energy to stay on top of this, and can't blame them, honestly. I was the young, ambitious dude at my firm I was at, and it seemed like I became somewhat of the COVID guy and having to tackle some of these new programs that were getting rolled out. And I got very involved with PPP loans and trying to help all the clients at our firm get PPP money. And it opened my eyes on the world of banking. So the Congress passed these PPP loans, but the way that they dispersed them was through the banking institutions. That was the quickest way that they could see to have some kind of verification process and disperse the money, because they were already kind of doing that with banks in some capacity. But not all banks are created equal. And there were some banks that did a really good job. There were some banks that did a really bad job. And honestly, there's some banks that my perception of those banks will never change because of what I saw happen during this PPP craziness. And it wasn't even that they had to fund the money, it was how they handled the communication and the relationship with the client. So on one end of the spectrum, you had banks like Provide, which was formerly called Lendeavor, which does a lot of dental loans. So we had a lot of clients with Provide. Provide didn't have a good system in their mind for dispersing PPP loans. So they immediately said if they had a client that needed PPP money, they were going to refer them to another bank, and they had a process for that. And that's fine. Obviously, it would have been preferred for the clients to be able to just go through Provide, who they had a relationship with, but they at least were communicative and had a process and another bank for them to go to. But then you go to a bank like Wells Fargo, who, in theory, said they were helping clients with PPP money, but they were extremely slow. They did not understand the rules properly. Their rollout had so much red tape internally. I don't mean to throw anyone under the bus, but any of our clients that had Wells Fargo had an extremely hard time getting money. It would have been better for Wells Fargo just to say to go somewhere else initially, but they spent a lot of time trying to go through the Wells Fargo process, which ended up hurting people in that first PPP window when time was important. But ultimately, I think what it taught is that the banking relationship matters. And there were some banks that really went above and beyond to make it work for their clients. And a lot of times when you're getting a loan, you just look at the lowest interest rate. Like, just give me the lowest interest rate. Who cares about who the bank is, what's behind the bank? But it really does matter what's behind the bank. Obviously, you can't just pay a super high interest rate because the bank has good service. You kind of need a good mix, but it does matter. Banking relationships do matter, and PPP brought that to the forefront. The fourth lesson or kind of story that I had was with ERC. So PPP was kind of the first wave of money that came out, and then they came out with PPP 2 at the beginning of 2021. So this was, let's just say, 9 months into COVID. PPP 1 had all been used up. Now there was PPP 2. But with PPP 2, there was also the addition of the employee retention credit, which previously you couldn't get PPP and ERC or employee retention credit, but then they passed a law where you could get both of them. So then this employee retention credit thing opened up. And the way that it happened, the way it was passed in the bill, it was a lot of the focus was on this second PPP loan. And that's what a lot of people were focusing on that missed out on the first one. They wanted to get the second. And a lot of people looked over this ERC thing, employee retention credit. So it went on for several months with many businesses not even knowing about ERC. At our company, we were part of this group, the Academy of Dental CPAs, and they were keeping us, there was a whole crew kind of staying in the loop on all the latest things. And we were able to stay on top of the ERC thing in real time. So we didn't, we were able to help calculate these credits for our clients in real time and help them get it pretty proactively. But not a lot of dental practices had that. And what ended up happening, because a lot of accountants didn't have the capacity to even get on top of PPP, let alone this new ERC thing, is several months go by, almost a year goes by, and a lot of businesses that should qualify for this employee retention credit don't get the credit because their accountants aren't guiding them through it. It's kind of a hard, nuanced thing for most accountants to get on top of. And then certain people find out about this and enter the space of tax credits who have no tax experience. We're talking about real estate professionals getting into processing employee retention credit. And the wild west of accounting, it gets crazy wild when it comes to this employee retention credit. And the credit is obtained by filing some tax forms. So ideally, you should understand tax law and some of the nuance with that. But there were people coming in that had no real understanding of tax law, but they had good sales experience and they knew how to market and pop up a website and do things to attract customers, but not really giving good tax advice on this employee retention credit. And this, I actually got wrapped up into the employee retention credit for quite a while and know quite a bit about employee retention credit. And I learned about just a spectrum for when it comes to taxes. And I think this applies to any tax strategy, but it definitely was to the extreme with the employee retention credit. On one side of a spectrum, you have these CPAs who are very busy, very hardworking, who are not able to stay on top of this employee retention credit thing. And they were telling their clients, just don't get it, don't do it, you don't qualify. When really, there were a lot of clients who should have gotten. I'm talking restaurants ordered to shut down. That's really like the poster child for the employee retention credit. But some of the accountants out there were telling their restaurants not to get it, right? And so they're just because they didn't have the time to really get on top of the subject matter. So you had these ultra conservative CPAs, and then on the other side, you have these ultra aggressive marketing people saying, "Hey, everyone qualifies. Anyone can get this credit." And there's this spectrum of truth, and as a small business owner, it is really hard to pick out who is telling the truth. And we saw this happen. And over time, the IRS has tried to crack down on this employee retention credit. I don't know if I agree with all of their tactics on this, but it opened my eyes on how different perspectives you can have with taxes. And there really is an opportunity to abuse taxes in the moment, and then later the IRS will come after you. But because you can abuse it in the moment, sometimes people make bad decisions on taxes. And there's a wide spectrum of strategy and aggressiveness. And you need to make sure you find your right place and right advisors on guiding you through nuanced tax issues. The last lesson that I learned, which isn't really a story, but well, I guess a little bit. So at the end of 2021, so this is after we had done 2 rounds of PPP, and after at our firm we had done ERC for most of our clients. At the end of 2021, I remember looking at our clients' bank accounts and comparing their December 2021 bank balance to their December 2019 bank balance. So pre-COVID, and I don't want to say like in the middle of COVID, right? And I was blown away at, for dental practice owners, the vast majority had significantly more cash in their bank account 2 years after COVID. And you can argue this is a good thing or a bad thing, but ultimately, there was a lot of assistance given to practice owners with the opportunity to increase their cash. But not everyone kept that cash. And over, after 2021 and into, the last couple of years, it's been interesting to see how people have utilized that extra cash. There was an opportunity to invest it in your business, as if you had struggling cash flow before. But it feels like the vast majority of people who were big spenders before COVID had all this cash and they just spent more money. People who were savers before COVID have been saving this money and have even more savings. And it was an opportunity for a lot of people that I think was wasted. For some people that took, for example, they took EIDL loans, which was not a grant, wasn't free money necessarily. You have to pay that back. And now they're stuck with these big EIDL loans and they spent a lot of that money. So just getting cash doesn't change behavior. And we saw that very much so with COVID, is that really your behavior needs to change first before any cash comes in or things like that. So definitely lots of lessons learned through COVID. Thanks for letting me share these 5 experiences. There's a lot of things we didn't talk about. Like, for example, staffing. Staffing in your dental practice was hard before COVID. It got a whole lot harder during COVID, and it's still massively hard today. And there's a lot of other things that created a challenge during COVID, but also created opportunities. Even for me personally, there were a lot of opportunities created because of COVID that I'm grateful for. And ultimately, I think with any adversity that we have, a lot of times it is what we make it, as challenging as that can be to accept. And I think a lot of people made the most of these last 5 years. And I'm just grateful it's behind us. And hopefully that never happens again. but I am doing my best to be prepared. I hope you are too, making sure you're following sound financial principles and having cash reserves, having a healthy practice, and doing the best you can to be prepared for anything that comes your way. Thanks so much for listening. If you have any COVID experiences you'd like to share, I'd love to hear them. If you go to the YouTube comments, the link in this in the show notes, love to hear any COVID experiences that you've had. Thanks so much for listening, and hope to have you next time.